welcome Judge Navi Pillay and Ms. Hina Jilani to our law school. Against the backdrop of the United Nations General Assembly, the 71st session, and in the shadows of the inauguration of the Perry World House, whose charge is to address some of the greatest challenges of our time, the law school joins Perry World House and the United Nations General Assembly in addressing some of the most urgent and pressing issues of our time with two of the greatest women human rights defenders of our age. Judge Navi Pillay on my right and Ms. Hina Jilani on my left, who I think in the most kind of magical way are together with us in the same room on the same day at the same time. I think there was a force, a very powerful force that really connived to bring that force together. And I want to take a moment to look at the ways in which these two women working in different regions of the world, their lives and their work intersect in such magical ways. But first of all, they are the embodiment of the human rights framework, the magnificent edifice of the human rights agenda. Judge Pillay has said, I am always conscious that I would be failing in my duty if I were to relax and fail to use the power of my office to keep the spotlight on advancing protection every minute of every day. That is her charge to you. And Ms. Hina Jilani has said, I always said that if you see injustice, you have to speak out against it. Otherwise, do not complain. So that is why we are here. Your lives crisscross in so many different ways. Two women, I'm proud to say, of South Asian origin, working in two different parts of the world. Navi was the first woman to start a law practice in Natal province, South Africa, during the apartheid regime. And Hina co-founded the first all-woman law firm in Pakistan during Zia-ul-Haq's dictatorship to fight extremism, militarism, and the Islamization of laws. Judge Pillay was the 5th UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the highest office on human rights in the United Nations. Hina was appointed as the first mandate holder as the Secretary General's representative on human rights defenders. Both your mandates directly intersected with your own personal experiences of gender discrimination and the attacks and threats that you faced as human rights lawyers and defenders on the ground in your countries. You were both in the vanguard of supporting and championing the rights of women, children, the most vulnerable, and workers' rights. While Navi, you defended apartheid activists and challenged the apartheid regime, Hina, you defended those charged under blasphemy laws and challenged impunity under the Hudud laws. More recently, Navi Pillay served as a judge on two of the most important international criminal courts in the modern era, as president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, then with the ICC. And you, Hina, you served on the advisory board on the coalition of the ICC, helping to set up the ICC. So in so many different ways, two women working in different parts of the region forged common cause on some of the most urgent issues of our time and changed the way in which we speak of human rights. You shaped the human rights agenda, the discourse, for generations to come. So I join the Penn Law community in welcoming you to this august university and our law school, but most of all, for doing what you have done and continuing to be at the forefront, the vanguard of the charge to change lives. I want you now to both take a minute to reflect on your lives and tell us some of the transformative moments of your life and how gender made a difference to you as a human rights defender. Navi, I start with you.
And you give me 1 minute for this.
I give you 3 minutes because I know that you're going to pick those transformative moments that help to be this turning point.
Yeah. Thank you, and I'm really very happy to be here. There's nothing that inspires one more than to be with young people, and especially on a campus. So I'm very pleased so many of you have sacrificed your lunch to be here. Hina and I are going to sacrifice lunch as well. Let me say once again how happy I am to be sharing this discussion here with Hina. We've often worked together, and I really admire. I went to Pakistan and saw the challenges under which the lawyers there work. The lawyers, even when I was there, were threatened. Hina's sister was under threat, and she was under special protection. And she said the threat came from the military. All right, 1 minute on what I'm doing is, so both Hina and I started in our own country. We were needed in our own country, and we addressed new issues. So really that's people who are taking things for granted, that you can't challenge this, you've got to be careful how you approach the judges. Under apartheid, you'll be thrown into prison, don't get involved in politics. So everything we did was small steps in our own countries. I was helped to go into university by my community, a poor community, who collected their sense to send me to university. And recently, I went back to the community. It was a Saturday afternoon to tell them what I had done. So it was very touching to meet the descendants of the community. So you might wonder how a few of us got to go to university. The universities were separated. The non-white students were educated in a potato warehouse. We couldn't go to the actual university. We couldn't access their libraries. For instance, 13 of us read out of one textbook on company law and bills of exchange. So you had 1 hour in the library, and you had to wait, stand over the student, actually, to get your hour to read this book. So those are the conditions. Students were shot at outside the campus by the apartheid police. Things were very tense. None of these political groups wished to address women's rights because they said liberation first, and then everything will fall in place. But the worst culprits for discrimination against women are these leftist political groups. So when I completed my 2 degrees and tried to get a job, nobody would take me because most of them were white firms, and they said they can't have me giving instructions to a white secretary. And secondly, what if you fall pregnant? And thirdly, well, is your father a lawyer or a businessman? What kind of business can you bring in? And that is why I started my own law practice, thinking, what's the worst that'll happen? I'll close after a few months. But we supported one another, all the black lawyers. I was the proprietor of the firm, obviously, but after 3 years, my husband, he had his own route. He first was a teacher, then he was detained by the police. So finally, he had completed his law degree, and the best place was that he gets articled to me. So we sent these papers to the Law Society, and they are absolute shock because a woman is a minor, subject to the guardianship of her husband. I can't enter a contract without his consent. The bank account was on his name. Everything I worked hard for, which I felt later were on his name. And so when we sent this in, the Law Society had a special meeting. Should they support the laws of the land or respect the rights of women? Unfortunately, they registered this contract where I was the principal and he is my pupil. So you see, a small thing. I didn't know the repercussions, so of course we took that up further and further, and within a few years, the community of property was amended to make the partners equal. So sometimes you aim for something and you achieve something else. And similarly with the exposure of torture that I did in all my cases, I did it when my husband was detained, and I will tell you, I was really scared of the security police. There's no way, don't think that I went there gung-ho fighting. No, I was very scared. because they could just pick you up for no reason and hold you indefinitely. I managed to get a court order that the police, security police, must not use unlawful methods of torture. And the police were furious, but the judge granted it. The sheriff threw it in his cell, and they never touched him after that. So I didn't get him out, but the torture affidavits were collected and sent to the United Nations, where they were gathered. After that, as you know, Stephen Biko was killed under torture, and the ANC asked the United Nations for two things: sanctions against South Africa. Well, that was vetoed by United States and UK. But the other thing they asked for is a convention against torture. And small steps, and we have a convention against torture today. So didn't directly lead there, but got on its way there.
Thank you, Navi. And this is a part of your story that we did not get a chance to hear this morning at Perry World House. So this is very special. Hina, you have faced many threats. You've been arrested, you've been imprisoned, you've been shot at in your own law firm because of the ways in which you challenge the Hudud Ordinance, which sees women as second-class citizens. Can you speak a little bit about your beginnings, starting the first women-only law firm, starting the Women's Action Forum as a movement to support some of the ways in which you challenged these laws in court, and then your work in the region, heading the South Asian Human Rights Forum?
Thank you so much, Rangita, for giving me this opportunity. Firstly, to be able to speak and interact with younger people and to get more feedback from them on their perceptions about human rights and the way that they would like to approach it in the contemporary world. But most of all, let me say that I thank you for your kind words about me. But to be able to be on the same platform with Navi Pillay is a really great privilege. And I don't think that any of us who claim to be women human rights defenders have made half as many contributions to the development of the notion that women, in the first place, have a place in the public domain, and secondly, that they're there to stay and to make a change, make a difference in the world, which is very, very significant. Just let me tell you that there, as you said, there have been 5 High Commissioners for Human Rights before this present one. 3 of them have been women. And I have been working constantly with the Office of the High Commissioner during all the 3 women who were, during the tenure of all these 3 women. And I can tell you that the kind of impact these women have made is durable. It is something that has brought to significance the very hidden contribution that women have made and human rights defenders in general have made to the development of a human rights normative framework, but also in terms of maintaining and forwarding the commitment of the United Nations in several fields. If there were no human rights defenders, I tell you that the agenda of the United Nations would never be fulfilled. And they work in all kinds of situations. Navi has given you a background of the backdrop against which she was conducting her activities for the promotion and protection of human rights. If I was to speak about myself, I would say, I belong to a family where my father was constantly in jail as a political prisoner throughout my childhood. So I suppose the transformation or some kind of seed must have been sown at that time. But my real kind of confrontation with realities came when I was a young lawyer. Even before I was a lawyer, I was working for political prisoners and going to prison and looking after their interests, maybe not legal, but other political interests. But during this period that I was a young lawyer and I was continuing my work in prisons, I suddenly noticed the plight of women prisoners and realized that one of the particular laws that had been enforced by a military regime in the name of Islam had increased the number of women in prison manifold. And this law was a very terrible law on the one hand, but totally ridiculous on the other, which was the law of adultery, or zina as we call it in the Islamic jurisprudence, where two consenting adults, on the one hand, could be tried for this offense of extramarital relationship. And on the other, the problem with this, the other problem with this was that this thin line of consent really resulted in many of the victims becoming the accused. So there were several women that I met in prison, sometimes as young as 12 and 13-year-old girls, who, because they had become pregnant as a result of rape, were unable to bring 4 adult male sane witnesses to say that it was rape, were being prosecuted for extramarital relationship. So this is what really kind of brought me to this realization that it's not just enough that you raise your voice outside against a particular law, but you put a face to the problem and bring the victim before these very institutions that are supposed to give justice. So that's what brought me in this whole process of litigating for the defense of those who have become so vulnerable because of what we call the rule of law. Because the rule of law in many countries means literally subjection to all kinds of laws, even though many of these laws are not fit to be a part of the rule of law, as we think of the rule of law. So this is where it all started. This is also the point at which, from a general human rights work, I shifted my focus to women. You know, human rights defenders are always confronted with this choice. Because as you said, human rights cannot be promoted without a full understanding of the context, the political context in which you're working. Courts are not independent. Social prejudices, especially against women, are prevalent in every institution, including the judiciary. So you have to choose. Do you go to the court or do you fight your battle in the street? We chose to do both. We went to court where we thought it was possible to get relief for an individual. But on the general issue, we thought raising public opinion in a background or in an environment where there is no freedom of expression, no freedom of movement, there is no freedom of association. In a military regime, that's not allowed. So public opinion, to mobilize public opinion becomes almost impossible. So, but the street was the place. Our right to protest can never be taken away. And that's what we did.
And one of the most, I think, the kind of consciousness-raising moments was when the Women's Action Forum that you mobilized marched on the streets to challenge the Safia Bibi decision, where a 13-year-old young girl was sentenced to public lashing because she was raped by her landlord's son and therefore had become pregnant.
This was a half-blind girl who had been raped but was not able to, the onus had shifted on her. She had to prove that she did not go into this relationship with her, own consent. The women's, and funnily, it wasn't the Women's Action Forum who did it. It was Punjab Women Lawyers Association. So it was young lawyers, women lawyers, who mobilized the male lawyers and in Pakistan's intellectual community. So there were professors, students, lawyers, doctors, all kinds of professional women and men who gathered to demonstrate on the 13th of February, 1983. And that was, I think, a turning point for all of us as women and men in Pakistan fighting a military regime, but also fighting what was sown into the minds of the people, which is that religious law in any way makes discrimination, marginalization, and oppression lawful.
Thank you, Hina. My question next is for you, Navi. In March of 2016, the ICC, in the Bemba case, found for the first time that rape and sexual violence constituted independent crimes against humanity. But the Bemba case stood on the shoulders of another landmark case, a watershed moment, that was decided by you, the Acacia case, which is often called the most important decision rendered thus far in the history of women's jurisprudence. And it was said that every once in a while a case comes along that for the first time firmly embeds legal theory into positive law. And such a case was the Acacia case that was decided by you, the only woman in the trial chamber. And you have said that in deciding that case, you wanted to send out a strong signal that rape was no longer a trophy of war. Can you take us through the Acacia case?
So stuff I said shouldn't be said by a judge, as you know. So it was to the media after that. You know, wherever I walk now, people forget my name and they say, Acacia. So can you imagine? For centuries, women were subjected to rape and sexual violence. It was not regarded as a crime. I looked at some old US military manuals. Yes, they promised these soldiers, you fight well, you can have all those yellow women. So this was some of my background. I was aware of this, and I was aware of how the women's movement was struggling to recognize rape during wartime as a war crime. So if you look at that background, then it was remarkable that we had this opportunity because very brave survivors of sexual violence from Rwanda were prepared to come and testify. It was really terrible for them because they'd been interviewed by male investigators, and there was nothing out of this for them. There was no compensation for witnesses. But they came, they said, to see justice being done. So I'm sitting there with my two colleagues, one from Sweden, one from Senegal, and when a witness started testifying that she was raped and she saw her 6-year-old daughter being raped by 3 men and she knew the names of those men. And then the prosecutor said, yes, but we didn't ask you all that. You didn't make a statement about all that. So he was stopping her because, you know, lawyers' defense will say, but you didn't say this earlier. So he was wanting to stop her and I said, we want to hear her. Now, don't you think that that is how justice should be conducted? Because I'm a lawyer for 30 years. I would do exactly the same. Oh, no, that is not alleged in the indictment. So we look for technical grounds to exclude any kind of evidence that is not charged. There was no charge of rape before us. Previously, an NGO person at the UNGA where I was speaking stood up and said out of 37 indictments or something at that point, there was not a single count of rape or sexual violence. And I said to her, you know, judge-like, I said, well, the judges can't interfere with that. You have to speak to the prosecutor. And all the time troubled by these blocks we're setting up against justice for people. And so we said we wanted to hear her, and all 3 judges questioned her. She said she could name the woman. So the prosecution could see that the judges were interested. So some people may criticize that as activism on the part of judges. But we were set up as an international tribunal looking at genocide and war crimes. These are very serious crimes. What the Security Council had when it set up that tribunals, and so our statute was the Security Council resolution. The Security Council passed the resolution after looking at an investigatory report. And that report recorded huge incidents of rape and sexual violence against women. So I felt that as a judge, I could take judicial notice of that and ask the questions. But, you know, that was one of the grounds of appeal that lawyers took and they lost, about a judge intervening and showing a bias. well, it's a bias towards justice, and if the evidence was not clear, there was no way we would go ahead and rely on that evidence. So the prosecutor applied for an extension of time to have the rape allegations investigated. So we gave the prosecutor 3 months, and we gave defense extra time because they now were facing new indictments. And honestly, that's how this historical decision came about, that opportunity that we opened up. All right, then we hear the evidence. It was horrendous evidence. So much of the evidence we could not rely on because those actual incidences were not alleged as allegations. And the one I know was the school teacher, and she was heavily pregnant, and Acacia was the school teacher, and he ordered people. He gave the orders for the rapes, just go and do what you want. Don't blame me tomorrow if you didn't have that fun. He was charged for aiding and abetting, even though he didn't commit any killing or rape. And this particular teacher's incident really moved me because they trampled on her until she aborted. And she was his colleague. They had been teachers before this came about, but we couldn't rely on that particular incident, but there was so much evidence. Now, as we heard the evidence, so for instance, people would say, we saw this gang of men raping the women, but judges need specificity. So the prosecutor asked, did you see him insert his penis in their vagina? And the women would get really mad at this, or the witnesses would get really mad. Well, I saw him drop his pants. What more do you want? That alerted me to the fact that there was no commonly accepted definition in international law of what is rape and sexual violence. The question of rapes during wartime came to the forefront through NGOs because it happened and was happening in Bosnia. So that's where boys and men were subjected to rape far more. But the traditional definition of rape is the penis and the vagina, the body part definition. So therefore, what happened to men in those wars was never charged as rape. It was charged as sexual violence. And so we had to draw up a definition. And that's where I reached out to academics. Because this is just too big when you have no precedent. I mean, Hina, as lawyers and judges, we always look for somebody else has done it, you build on that. So we had nothing to build on, and then I got help from academics in the US. I'm very grateful to them. So we looked at various ones, and the definition. It's gender neutral. It's the physical invasion of a sexual nature of a person under coercive circumstances. And that was then built on by the Yugoslav tribunal. So for the very first time, conviction of rape of men, because they were able to use that definition. And then in my own country, the Judge Goldstone, who was sitting there, alerted the judges to this decision. They had before them a case referred by a lower court where a little boy, a 4-year-old boy, had been abused. And the crime was sodomy, and the sentence was very low, whereas if it was a girl child, there's a huge penalty. And he felt, surely you have to look at the suffering of the victim in order to determine sentence. So he sent that to the Constitutional Court. And they relied on the Acacia definition to say, yes, we need and they ordered the government to come up with the gender-neutral definition. So I don't know, is that what you asked me?
No, I asked you to take us through that journey of the way in which, you as a woman judge sought out evidence of rape, although the prosecutor had not brought it up, and to walk us through that whole process. And I think you did a great job of doing that.
But to the credit of my 2 colleagues, my male colleagues, they were wholly supportive of the issue, except they felt very embarrassed. Just didn't want to hear all this evidence of vagina and so on. Please, yes, you handle it. But otherwise, they rendered justice as I did.
Thank you. Thank you. My next question is to you, Hina. Hina, you were appointed as the voice the moral authority for human rights defenders because you were the preeminent human rights defender on the ground in Pakistan. And I often say that one of the most transformative moments in my own life has been visiting you in your office that still has, to this date, bullet holes that are there because you've been shot at. And one of the most, I think, profoundly disturbing cases is the case of Samia Sawa, this young woman who came to you seeking legal representation in seeking a divorce from her abusive husband. And she was shot at by her mother and her uncle with her mother's complicity under this rubric of this being an honor crime and under the both the Qisas and the Diyat legal regime. This was done in an environment of impunity. And I want you to speak a little bit about the case and the way, as a human rights defender, that you used to mobilize a movement against honor crimes and to change and to roll back some of the most draconian provisions of the Hudud Ordinance.
That was not the first time that the whole issue of honor killings was raised. We were raising the issue of honor killing much before the Samia Sarwar case happened. Let me begin with this legal aid organization that we had set up, and the focus was women. And I realized at one point that it's not enough just to take women's cases to court. There are so many other needs that they have in a situation where they are in distressful circumstances. It's not just the court hearing that is affecting their life, because I used to have women standing outside my gate all the time saying, we can't live with our own family because our marital family is threatening them, so everybody has refused to give me shelter. I need a shelter. So that is when 27 years ago, I started a women's shelter to bring in women who were on the one hand litigating, but on the other were facing high risk of bodily harm and mental torture at the hands of the very institution which is supposed to support them, that is the family. And this compels women really to look for alternatives. And there were none that were available which would give them a peaceful environment to sit down and decide what they want to do with their lives. This is a unique shelter because the rights of admission are reserved only for those who are under a real and high risk of physical harm. So a lot of women who were fleeing violence in the name of honor killings, which were threatening, that those were threats to their lives and to also taking away their autonomy of choice in choosing their partner, either because of forced marriage situation or because they were stopped from marrying somebody of their own choice. So these were the type of women who were coming into the shelter. Samia Sarwar was one of them. And also, this is not my first encounter with violence in that sense. When I was 12 years old, there was an attempt on the life of my father. And they didn't get him, but they got a journalist who was interviewing him at that time. And that young person was killed in my house, right outside the house. So I have seen these situations. Nevertheless, these are situations that never prepare you to be kind of blasé about them. They are always extremely disturbing, and they follow through the whole of your life. This was one instance where, even during the blasphemy case that we were doing, 2 of my clients were killed right there in front of me. And they didn't mean to shoot me, but
Can you tell us a little bit about what the blasphemy laws are?
It's a long story. But very briefly, these were again laws that were enforced during the Islamization period of the 80s, which a military dictator was trying to impose on Pakistan. They created a law, an offense, which is called the offense of blasphemy. The major problem with that is that the blasphemy is not against God, it was against the Holy Prophet of Islam. The problem with that was that this was one single offense in the whole of criminal justice history, I think, which did not have the element of intent in it. So whether you intend or do not intend, the listener decides. Those who hear the words or any kind of writing decide whether it is blasphemous or not. Because the subjective feeling of somebody reading or hearing someone will define whether they have offended your religious feelings and you have been derogatory about the Islamic holy figures. This law, I think, is one of the biggest examples of the use, but not just the abuse of the law, but also the use of the law for malicious purposes. This law has been used by sectarian groups in Pakistan to target other Muslim sects. So everybody was vulnerable to any kind of allegation of blasphemy. This law was used against non-Muslim minority communities to get them involved in blasphemy cases. These were used by individuals, for instance, for petty revenge against the other. Personal property, disputes became the motives for allegations against blasphemy. In one particular case, which was perhaps the first one that got real publicity and visibility, although there had been many before them, was that of a 12-year-old Christian boy who was accused of blasphemy. And with him, 2 adults were also accused. I remember I appeared as a lawyer to get one of the adult accused, bail. Within 10 days, I saw him being killed on the street. And not by the complainant, not by the person who had accused him, because that person was only being string pulled by big religious groups. They were the front for the religious group. It was the religious group who had arranged the assassination of this man. So, I mean, these kind of things at one time seemed not so horrible because they were happening every day. Today, I'm happy to say it doesn't happen that much. But not that it doesn't happen that much. And the kind of impunity that we were seeing in those days, that has in some ways been controlled, but because of the struggle of human rights lawyers who were knocking at the conscience of the courts and asking them to become more independent and rise above their own social biases. So these hundreds of cases for women's rights, for minority rights, for children's rights, did bring about a change in the judicial mind in my country. We are still grappling with a lot of problems. Nevertheless, I think that we did open the way for better justice than we used to get, say, about 20, 25 years ago. This woman who was killed was a woman who was fleeing from honor killing, and she had sought refuge in our shelter. I was also her client because she was suing her estranged husband for divorce, which her parents were not allowing her to do. It was her mother who came into my office by prior arrangement and brought the assassin with her. This was the first case in which there were third-party witnesses. All the lawyers were witnesses. Some of my clients were witnesses to this murder. I was the complainant in this case. And we thought this would be the best case for prosecution for honor crimes, and we could make it an example because independent third-party witnesses were present. We failed. We failed not because the judiciary was not with us. I took this case right up to the Supreme Court. It took 7 years of my life. But we failed because of the law. There is a law in Pakistan which makes murder a compoundable offense, which means you can the heirs of the victim can enter into a compromise with the accused and forgive him. And that compromise, if accepted by the court, results in acquittal. So we had a good case, but the father and the mother, who were conspirators in her murder, and the estranged husband, acting on behalf also of his two sons, forgave the uncle who was the actual person who had pulled the trigger. And when I was in the Supreme Court, I said, look, you have to examine the whole, the result of this particular law and see whether people are now benefiting from their own wrongdoing. Because in the case of honor killing, it's always the family who kills their woman. And then they conspire again to enter into a compromise and forgive the member of the family who has actually pulled the trigger. So if it is the father, the brother of the woman will, enter into a compromise and forgive them, or they'll force young minor children of the woman. If it is the husband, he will force his own children to forgive him. So these are things that we are confronting right now. This is one of the laws against which this Samia server case opened the space. Because as I said, when you put a face to the problem, then the judiciary understands, and then the parliament understands that there is, of course, this is injustice. And that is when they understand that either Islamic law has been distorted, or if it has not been distorted, then in the contemporary world, this kind of justice doesn't work. And the law is now under amendment.
Mostly because of the kind of
Mostly
pressure
because of
and
the pressure and the kind of
yes.
political pressure that we built. And remember, human rights can never be promoted in isolation.
Or in a
and
vacuum.
This is the same for women. You have to build political pressure. So never be cynical about politics.
Wise words to the next generation of human rights defenders here at Penn Law. Navi, I have a question for you. 1994, during the, in 1995, during the Fourth World Women's Conference, we heard a clarion call that reaffirmed that women's rights are human rights, now and forevermore. And the 1990s was defined as the decade for women's human rights. And in 2011, you made out a strident call for LGBT rights as human rights. And for the first time, the High Commissioner for Human Rights really embraced LGBT rights as part of her mandate. You produced and released the first report on the human rights of LGBT persons that really mapped the criminalization of homosexuality in over 90 countries, the laws that disempowered LGBT communities, and that became then the kind of blueprint for the Secretary General to affirm that where there is tension between cultural attitudes and universal human rights, rights must carry the day in terms of LGBT rights. So can you speak a little bit about that, which I would say a paradigmatic moment in your own charge?
Well, obviously I attended to very many human rights issues all over the world. That was the mandate. But some states, particularly from the Middle East and Africa, told me not to touch the issue of LGBTI rights. And so, somebody tells you not to do something, you want to find out why.
You would want to.
I would want to. And so because their argument was, do not introduce new rights and only address rights that are internationally accepted. So this is a new regime of rights for specific peoples, and otherwise various groups will ask for their own specific rights. So being a lawyer and a judge, you look at the law, say, what is this law? It's a universal declaration. It says all rights for all people. It doesn't say except LGBTI, except women, and so on. So in the simplest words, that's what I argued. But we had very good staff, I must credit them, with finding the facts and the information. And we started off by so I made the speech, got a resolution passed in the council that we do a study on violence and discrimination affecting the LGBTI people. So notice we didn't go into the equality. We started with that, and when they objected, I responded by asking them, so are you condoning violence and discrimination? Especially your country here. So are you condoning violence and discrimination? Of course they're going to say, no, we don't condone. Those two studies were an eye-opener in every corner of the world. The discrimination, the ill treatment, violence, and the fact that it's a crime. Some countries have the death penalty for it. The abuse and stigmatization is so awful that it is amazing that that issue had never been addressed at an international level. You know, and once you open a little can, you keep opening it further. So we then launched, we had the two studies, and each time reported these facts. And the GA also was interested in hearing it because the Secretary General was very, very supportive. The Secretary General said himself that he himself had been prejudiced against LGBTI people. So very honestly, he admitted that, and then he really threw in his support there. And then my office started a campaign all over the world, and the campaign was launched in Cape Town with me present, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and Judge Edwin Cameron, who's our gay judge on our Constitutional Court. So we launched it. And guess what? We launched it as an equality campaign. So when the Secretary General of the Islamic States came to see me, they said, we like you, we like you, we support what you're doing, but this, no, we cannot support this. And so I said to him, well, if you read the papers in the UK recently, the King of Saudi Arabia's grandson sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for killing his gay partner. See, you have the death penalty in Saudi Arabia for homosexuality. And yet there's a pretense that it doesn't happen. And I said that particular person, who probably, maybe I'm exaggerating, was he a friend, partner, slave to this prince? I don't know, but he killed him. A British court sentenced him. And the lawyers' defense were much more concerned in hiding these facts, that they shared a room, they watched pornography. The CCTV cameras recorded him beating up this person. And so I very quietly say to this person, and he's shuddering each time hearing this, I said, this is why we need to address the issue and protect people. And then he said, all right, we'll support you on ending violence and discrimination, but not same-sex marriage. And I said, I'm not going there yet. I'm only focusing on violence and discrimination. But as I said, on the campaigns we launched, we went on equality, because that's what the Universal Declaration promises, equality to everyone. Clearly aware as a lawyer that once you speak about equality, you are going in the direction of same-sex. But so, you take it step by step. That's as far as we got on that issue.
Hina,
can I just say something else? So Uganda, in the middle of all this, increases its penalties. So I go to Uganda. The president couldn't see me. I see the vice president, and he said, oh, how his mother will die of shock if he slept with another man. Yeah, they always personalize this. And I said to him, do you remember years ago when we wrote with our left hand, the teachers would beat you up or tie your hand? And I said, would you condone that today? He says, no. I said, then what do you think? And he said, yes, you're right. We need education. We need education to get out of these prejudices we have.
I love the way you use that example that would resonate in Uganda, because I think that was something that would be culturally very appropriate.
Yeah.
Hina, you are part of a group of elder statespersons who were brought together and convened by Nelson Mandela, a group of world leaders, to address some of the greatest challenges of our time. And you were with the elders this weekend, and on Monday, meeting with the General Assembly, meeting with the Secretary General on some of these urgent crisis situations of our time. Can you share with us some of the content of those conversations? We want to be a witness. We want to be part of that conversation.
I think the most important issue right now with the UN General Assembly was the plight of refugees and the so-called crisis, as they call it, that was emerging in Europe. The funny thing is that while it is the United Nations, when something hits Europe, it becomes a global phenomenon. And this is, I think, this was a particularly important session of the UN General Assembly because they've come out with what they call a New York Declaration on refugees and migrant workers. You know, there are several countries in the world who have been hosting millions of refugees for years, for decades. It was never termed as a crisis at that time. In my own country, we hosted 3 million Afghan refugees, out of which 2.5 million are still there. Pakistan has not ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention. I am no stranger, therefore, to the extreme distress that these refugees face and the perilous journeys that they have gone through in those decades, because there is a protracted refugee situation. At the same time, one must also not be dismissive of the immense stress and political, social, and economic challenges that these host countries are facing. And the situation of the refugees becomes even more difficult when there are governments in those countries who lack the commitment to human rights, or these are countries where there is no capacity to fulfill human rights. I think this New York Declaration is perhaps the first step, but only the first step, towards awakening the conscience of the international community that it has to be a burden that has to be equitably shared. And that there has to be a sustained, a genuine, and a transparent commitment to implement international law applying to refugees. So I think this was the main message that the elders were also giving at the UNGA. I was asked to address the plenary session there. And I'm happy to say that at least many of the states were paying lip service to it. The question is, how long are we going to live with that lip service? The test is when you look at some happy faces within the refugee communities in many of these countries. So far, there are none. The images that we remember is the body of a 4-year-old child sprawled on the beach, or that heart-wrenching image of this child sitting on a chair, helplessly wiping blood off his face. These are images we need to change. We need to let the people in the host countries and regions where flight is being taken to know that there are advantages. That there are many countries, and Uganda is one of the examples, where they have put out the positive aspects of their development that has come because of migrant workers and refugees. And there is no shortage of such examples. Look at this country. Where would they have been? The kind of human resources, the kind of development potential that these people have is lost because of the prejudice, because of the marginalization of this population, and the refusal to utilize their potential.
And my last question is to you, Navi. You have often bemoaned the fact that of the 3 pillars of the United Nations, the pillar of human rights has often been the most marginalized of the pillars. So now we are at the cusp of electing a new Secretary General. And on the eve of that election, what is the advice that you would give the new Secretary General, whom we all hope would be a woman, the first woman, the history-making woman to head the United Nations? What is the advice you would give her, hopefully, in strengthening that 3rd pillar on human rights at the United Nations?
Well, we all know that the United Nations is a body of governments, but the Charter speaks about we the people, as your constitution does. So first advice, you put the people back in there, provide a forum, space to hear civil society. They don't have that now. So it's just talk amongst governments. Civil society is outside the door, they're banging on windows. So greater democratic space for civil society. And secondly, the UN is based on 3 pillars: peace and security, development, and human rights. They dropped human rights from the jargon. And then they pushed human rights out there in Geneva. Human rights, oh, go and raise it over there. And then when I arrived, I found everybody was referring to the 3rd pillar, the 3rd pillar. And we all know, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, there's a hierarchy. If you come 3rd, yeah, you don't get the same funding as for the 1st. And so I stopped all reference to 3rd pillars. You could say one of the 3 pillars, but you don't grade them that you can do without human rights. So that will be my second advice, to make sure that that human rights is given the respect and seriousness it should. And thirdly, that the entire United Nations must see it as their responsibility to promote human rights, not just the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So that's what I would say to her. But may I say something to the students? This conversation started about human rights defenders. So do you know what's happening to human rights defenders all over the world? By whom we mean students and journalists and lawyers, just ordinary people, women human rights defenders, especially on economic, social, and cultural rights, are being threatened all over the world. So please check up the website of the Human Rights Council and see what happened in June and July and so on. What happened before this is a human rights activist from China who had already contributed to this UPR review. You know about that. That's where the human rights record of every state is examined. She had contributed to that, and she was on her way to participate when China was being reviewed. She was detained in China. She died in custody. And the NGOs in the council, I wasn't there, this is after I'd left. The NGOs asked whether they could use their speaking time, which is just 1 minute each, to hold a moment of silence in honor of their colleague. And that was refused by China, and including my country, South Africa. They said it will create a dangerous precedent and so on. So that's one incident which fed into having a special resolution passed respecting the rights of human rights defenders to use the UN, because they were suffering reprisals just for using the UN. Now that resolution was so tightly contested, and eventually they won it by a few votes. But a number of countries, if I can just remember, Russia, the usual, Russia, China, Belarus, Cuba, but South Africa in the middle of it. And what was South Africa querying? They didn't like the words human rights defender there. So we started this conversation about human rights defenders, and I just want to alert you, there's a challenge and pushback even to the use of those words. And as Hina pointed out, you can have good laws. Nothing moves unless human rights defenders demand implementation, unless lawyers bring these cases. So all these people are at risk. It's a crying shame what they are being sentenced to for things that you can say so easily here. A blogger in Vietnam sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. journalists in Ethiopia, huge terms of imprisonment. Two of them had come, I don't know whether to this university, but US universities, had exposure to some education, went back and wrote articles. Yeah, both are in imprisonment. I knew the exact terms, but they're huge terms, like 2 decades each. So my heart goes out to human rights defenders, and we need your strong support to watch out for this.
Thank you, Navi, for those inspiring words. And with that, I think there's a good moment to ask our human rights defenders in this room to ask a few brief questions. And I want to go back to what you said, Hina, that we are all human rights defenders. And anyone who speaks up for human rights is a human rights defender. There isn't a special examination to pass, right? And that is what you have always said as the first mandate holder, that every citizen is and should be a human rights defender. So 2 quick questions we can take before we end this fascinating conversation. Questions? Or even a quick comment? Yes.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Most countries in the world do not allow class actions, like in this country. Look at the tobacco industry. There was a class action, and then the whole society, the whole world benefits. I was recently in places like Guyana and Suriname talking to the judges, and the judges were whispering, what can they do unless the lawyers bring the case? And the lawyers are not trained to bring these cases. And I know that those South African litigation center could be helpful to them. You know that they brought the case against the president himself, made him pay back the money, the taxpayers' money that he used on his house. That was one. And the other one saying the South African government violated the law in failing to arrest al-Shabir, the president of Sudan. So they do such important work, and class actions, you're right. I don't know how we can do that. You have to change the laws. I think Hina would be able to tell you more of that. You're right. You bring a case, it benefits that individual. I think if you have constitutional courts, they're more helpful in entertaining. Well, clearly we haven't. It's there in international law, but it's a good start because it was never even under international law until now. We are encouraging states to pass laws, civil society organizations, to ask that those crimes be made national crimes. Over here, you remember, here and in Austria, there was the young girls who were imprisoned by men, and impregnated and so on. I watched carefully what were they charging, because those countries didn't have sexual enslavement. They charge for murder and so on. So that's the first step, is to get these recognized as national crimes. And if they are prosecuted, then they will send out a message to people that it's a crime. But, I agree with you. We must experience great concern over the lack of investigation and prosecution of sexual crimes, including sexual abuse of children.
No. Oh, she's back. I think, is your question for President Zuma?
She's from Pakistan,
She's from
and
Pakistan.
bad things don't happen there.
I don't know whether it's President Zuma or not, but certainly there has been a change in the way that South Africa is supporting the more human rights-focused issues. And I do believe that Navi can perhaps comment on that. But it is a good support country that I think in many ways we have lost.
So it's a great day for Penn Law to be able to host two of the greatest human rights defenders of our time. Once when I spoke to you, Navi, you reminded me that in the pantheon of human rights defenders, there are three men: Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King, who come to our minds. But I want to add to that list of illustrious names two women human rights defenders, Navi Pillay, Hina Jilani. We thank you for the lives that you have led, the work that you have done, not just for us, but for generations to come. So on behalf of Penn Law, we are grateful to you. And please know that we are your greatest champions as you continue to do this work during the most intractable times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.